Hello, Josh Sideris here. Today I'm going to do a tutorial on DOTcss. DOTcss is my answer to dynamic JavaScript generated styles for web applications. As far as I know, it is the most powerful JavaScript style builder, and as of my recording this, it is the only framework that I know of that can animate 3D transformations. DOTcss was originally built to complement my other framework, DOThtml, which is a JavaScript-based page builder. If you want to learn more about .html, I'll leave a link in the video description where you can learn more. So let's jump into it. This is a template project I have set up. This is actually generated by a script that just generates this template for me. So I'm just going to delete some of the libraries that I don't need. And then here are the two that we're interested in. .html, which I'm going to use to show you the first example, and .css. I'll show you the first example just because .html was originally the target for .css, and if you're using .css, I hope you also try my other framework, .html. It's a great framework. .css is an independent library, so after the first example, I'll just show you how to use .css to manipulate raw HTML. So for the first example, we will use dot and target the body element, and we'll create a div. Now, if I wanted to stylize this div, you could use the style attribute, like so. And then normally what you would do is just pass a string that would go inside of the style attribute. So this could be like width 50 px and so on. But with .css, the idea is that you could just call .css some of the member functions here, like width, and set values in here. So I'm gonna set the width to 100, and these the width and height values are going to be in pixels. That's the default unit for any length property. And we'll set a background color so that we can see it. Alright, and if we run this, oh, I think I made a typo here. Okay. So let me explain how this works. The style function takes in a string, as I've mentioned. This doesn't necessarily pass back a .css object into .html, or at least .html is an independent framework and doesn't have any ties to .css, so it can't interpret the object. But what's happening is .css is a collection of functions for one function for every CSS property, and then we have these chainable functions. So any type of width function is going to take in a width value, and the default, as I've mentioned, the default unit is pixels. And each function returns a .css builder object, which can be chained, so you can call additional functions from that object. And then ultimately, once this whole thing executes and returns the final builder, the builder object has a toString override that generates the CSS string. So something fun we can do is just take that and pass it into a console.log. And let's see what we get. And yeah, so there's your CSS, and I'll explain to you what the target property is, the target field in there. But let's go back into the code, and then I'll just do toString. And there you go. So it actually generates your CSS. Okay, so if we didn't want to use .html, we could just use pure .css, and we can create our objects in HTML. Oh, there you go. And .css can be used to target any CSS selector. So the way we do that is by using the .css object as a function, and you just pass in your CSS selector right here. And since it's class, we'll put the dot. Yeah, so that will have the exact same effect, except I gotta get rid of the toString. I guess not that it matters. I guess it would still work with the toString, but yeah. So each one of these functions, in order, well, the first function is going to target the div, and then each following function will one at a time apply that style to the div. So let's see how this runs. So you get the same thing as before. Awesome. So regarding units, the default unit is pixels, but if you wanted to state that explicitly, there are two ways to do it. One is that you could, you can always just put the unit here, or you can, set this to a string like this. So this will render as 100% instead of pixels. So it's smart enough to understand when you're passing in a string. If you wanted to as well, there are different versions of these length functions. Every length function has different versions with units in mind. So if I wanted to set the width in EMs, you can just do it like this, or you can explicitly state PX. Typically, whatever the name of the unit is, or whatever the text for that unit is, that's the extension that's the suffix that you would use for the function. The only exception is percentage, because that wouldn't be a valid variable name, so you could just use P for that. And now if I type in 50, it'll take up 50% of the width. So let's take a look, just like that. So yeah, it's pretty robust. You can also set the color by typing in a raw number, which is a nice feature. So if you wanted to just type in hex numbers, you could do that, and that would be, I guess, some shade of gray, right? Or you could just use the oh, I don't like how Visual Studio Code does that. Or you could just use the standard color codes in CSS like this, or even the 3-digit ones like so. And another thing is that if you want to set RGB or RGBA, well, sure, you could just do RGB and then type in your numbers here, or you could pass it in like this, 255. Let's just pass in some random numbers here. So just parameterize it like this, and then the fourth parameter is optional. This would be your A value if you want to have an RGBA, or you can just have an RGB color, and there you go. So something else you can do, which is kind of handy, is if you have a URL data type, normally you would use the URL function. You don't actually have to use that. Just pass in your URL. Now I haven't done this yet, but in CSS it's also possible to have something like none or initial. So that will actually render as a URL right now. I'm gonna fix that. That'll be my next update. And another thing is multiple URLs. This is valid. So what I'll do is this will be the syntax for multiple URLs. Not in the current version that I'm demonstrating right here, but in future versions. Actually, these should all be different in theory, but yeah. So this would be the syntax if you wanted to have multiple URLs associated with a property. Actually, I've never personally used this feature, so I'm not quite sure what it does, but apparently it is supported by the spec. Let's reverse this. Now, this CSS is applied to objects that already exist. So if you were to create any new objects after this statement is called, they will not be applied with the property. So I'll do an example. I probably shouldn't have removed .html. But let's say that I call this, so it applies this to the div that's being set up here, and let's say I wanted to use .html to add a new div to the body. Oops. With the same class name. So I'm just gonna, I'll set this back to 100 so that we can see clearly. And if I refresh it, so you can see that, you know, the other div didn't really show up. And if I move this code, oops, how do I do this? And refresh, so there it is. Now, if I wanted something that applied to all divs with this class, there is a way to do that. And this is actually the very last feature that I added to .css before making this video. It's probably not a perfect feature, so it's something that's, you know, it's in the works, but here's how you would do it. You just need to add, excuse me, you need to add curly brackets here. Okay. So let's back up a sec and investigate what happens when I'm actually calling this. So if I open the file, I'll refresh it, right click on this, inspect, and you can see that the style attribute is being set on this element. All right. Now if I go back here and I add the curly brackets here, and I refresh the page, so now all of the elements of that class have those styles. And the way that this works is it doesn't actually apply it to the style of those elements. It creates a style tag in the head of the document. So I actually see this question pop up on Stack Exchange from time to time. Well, how do you do things like setting pseudo selectors in JavaScript? Like, let's say I want to have like an on hover. And you know, the answer is always, oh, you got to do it with JavaScript events. You know, you have to do an, you know, on mouse over, and you know, no, you don't have to do that. You can actually just, you know, this is a hack. You can just add the a style element to the head of your document. So if I wanted to, I could even do this with this also unlocks pseudo selectors. So you know, actually, well, I guess you know, I guess you'd only have the hover for color, not for width and height. And there, so yeah, and then if we take a look at the inspector, it just creates two style things. Now, like I said, this is a new feature, and it's not really efficient. It adds a new style tag every time, and it doesn't actually check if an existing rule is being overwritten. So, you know, if I could do that, you know, in theory, I could have something a little bit more efficient that doesn't, you know, cloud up your document with conflicting rules. But I don't even know like whether that would matter. But I guess if you had a lot of styles being set in rapid concession, you know, you could have a really bloated document. Maybe I guess that's technically a memory leak. So in the future, you know, maybe I could clean that up. But hey, you know, it works for now. It gets the job done, and it's a feature that I really wanted to add. Okay, so let's just backtrack a little bit. And the next thing I want to talk about is transformations. So the way that you do this is there's a transform function. And in here, you can just pass in the string for the transformation. So you can do rotate 15 dig. Yeah, and that'll be a valid transformation. So let's try that. And there you go. Now you can also do the transformations by using the built-in .css functions. And again, this is a different set of chainable functions using the .css object. Oh, sorry, .css.rotate. And you have another case in here where you have different units available. So degrees are the default units. But let's say you wanted this in radians. Unlike length, in this version of .css, you can't just use the unit suffixes for transformations. But if you did want to use a different type of unit, you could just pass in a string with the specific unit for angle that you want. Now what this function does is it will return a .css transform function which is chainable. So if I wanted to, I could also add a skew, and skews are also in degrees, but I'll just add a number in there. And you can see that it's become skewed now. Some functions will take multiple parameters. So like if I did translate, I think translate actually you can, obviously you can put in two parameters, X and Y, but I think you just put in X and it will work. So, you can put in like, 50, and this actually will accept pixels or, any units for that matter. And .css will internally convert them into pixels. But the default unit, as always, is just pixels if you put an integer or decimal. And yeah, so you can, actually the tooltips there are helping. And then, you can do things like matrix 3D. And matrix 3D actually takes 16 parameters. So anyway, you use it exactly the same way as you would just create the CSS string. So I don't really need to go into too much detail on that. Yeah, experiment, and if you make a mistake, it will give you an exception. So there's something really important that I need to say. Outer namespace here where all the properties are attached, and then inside the transform, there's I'm using the same namespace for all the transform functions. This really isn't a problem because for the most part, there's no collision between properties and transformation functions. However, there is one collision, and that's with the perspective. Perspective is both a property in CSS, and it is also a CSS transform function. Perspective gives depth to 3D objects. So you can see here's an example without perspective. Here's with perspective, using the perspective property and using the perspective function. Actually, the property kind of looks deranged a little bit. The difference between the property and the function appears to be that the property does a 2D projection of the perspective, whereas the perspective function properly preserves all of the 3D vertexes and depth information. So since there's a name conflict, what I've done is I've just renamed the property to perspective 2D. So if you do want to use the property, that's the name, because it's a 2D projection. So I've cleaned up here by getting rid of all the stuff we don't need, and so we're back to our basic transformed box. And I'm going to show you animations. So the way that this works is, first of all, you have to select an element to animate, and we're going to select the same red div, even though it's not red anymore. And then you choose the property that you want to animate. Well, why don't we just animate the div back to red again? Virtually any property can be animated. The library is extremely robust. You can animate different units, you can animate colors, you can animate transformations, you name it. But I'll show you an example. So if I wanted to animate background color, you write background color, and instead of using it as a function, you use it as a field. And the prototype for this field contains an animate function. And in here, you can just pass in the new value to which you want to animate. So in this case, we're going to do red. The default length of time for this animation is 100 milliseconds, but the animate function accepts the following parameters: value, duration, style, and complete. Value is the color you want to set. Let's be a little creative here. And by the way, background color accepts multiple parameters, so you can just use an array. And we could be a little creative with it. Boom, boom, boom. Oh, and .css knows that decimal values are not valid colors, so it won't use the decimal values. It'll round everything to an integer and make sure that it's bounded correctly. So duration, let's do 200 millisecond durations. Style, I think I have two styles right now. There's linear and ease. So ease. Ease is a rounded animation using a cosine function, and linear is exactly as it sounds, just a direct linear animation. Ease is the default style, so we'll remove the word linear so we can get an ease animation. I'm going to create a function. Oops, animate. And we'll call it down here so that so the function is declared, then it's called, and then it just keeps calling itself every 200 milliseconds after the animation. So this will just change this div to a bunch of random colors. Yeah, psychedelic. All right, so let's clean this up. Oh. And we'll set a 1 second animation, and let's try animating a transform this time. So the way you do it is transform.animate, and then for the first parameter you can just use .css. Let's do a rotate y, and we'll rotate it to 45 degrees. So you can see that we've gone from having a skew and a rotation into having a completely different set of transformations, and it's quite smooth. Now this method of transforming the object from one set of transformations to another is actually not trivial, and it's a bit of a it's not quite a precise science. But I'm going to do a blog post explaining how I accomplish this, because there's a lot of caveats with it, and if you really want to understand how it works because you want to use it for any type of advanced transformation, then it's important to understand the nuances of it. So I'll post a link to that in the video description when it's ready, but I haven't written the blog yet, so keep an eye on the video description, and it'll be up when it's ready. It's really quite remarkable some of the stuff you can do with this. So I'll show you another example, and I brought back the animate function. And this time let's just add a parameter here. 0, and so we'll rotate this by this angle. So anything except for rotate Z is essentially a 3D transformation, and just raw rotate is a rotate Z. So I want this thing to maybe lean forward a little bit. So let's rotate it along the x-axis by 15 degrees. Get rid of the skew. And we'll keep this here. And the order of the transformations, of course, matters. But I think that looks good, so let's try running that. So that's pretty cool. The reason it looks a little choppy there is because I have the smooth transition on, or actually technically it's ease. That's the default transformation mode or style. So if we put it to linear, it will actually be smoother as a continuous animation. So look at that. Beautiful. And here you can see how it works. It's just updating the style property of this div. And that's kind of cool. It rotates the margins as well. Pretty neat. But you have to use .css as a function and target specific elements using the query selector. You can't just pass .css into a .html style function, because that just renders it as a string and writes it directly to the property, so animations won't work. And you also cannot add a style tag using the curly bracket system. I suppose it would technically work, but it would work by adding a whole bunch of style tags to the top of your document, which is rather inefficient. So as of creating this video, that feature is not supported, and when it is supported, there'll be documentation posted on the .css website. There are a few more supporting functions that I just wanted to show off. Now, I built these originally because I didn't want to use jQuery. I don't even use really jQuery anymore. For the most part, .css and .html are enough, and I think their combined file size is less than jQuery min. We'll put this in a timeout so that there's a little bit of delay from when this thing starts. And I guess I'll kill the animation because we don't want that. And we'll make the square a little bit bigger. Okay, great. I always do this. We'll make it so that this happens after 1 second. And so the first of these supporting functions is hide. So I can do .css, and this is a query selector, .hide. Oopsie. Now I can call that, and that will instantly hide the div, but you can also add a duration if you want. So let's do a 1 second duration, and we'll test this out. So it hides it, and as it's hiding, it also fades it, so it's very similar to the way jQuery does it. I wanted it to be comparable. It's very smooth. And you can also add an onComplete event like this. And you know, I can do the reverse. Obviously, there's a .css. So we'll add a 1 second animation for the show. And I also just want to show you that the show and hide functions preserve the original properties of the element that's being transformed. So so if you were to set opacity to 50%, so there it is with 50% opacity, shrinks and reappears, and the opacity was preserved. You can also pass in some advanced options. So if instead of doing this, you wanted to have, you can just pass in an object like this and do it like this, like so. And there's also a property called hide style, and there are 3 options. You can do normal, which is the default fade. So this won't have any shrink animation. I'll show you what that looks like. That just fades out. And then there's shrink, which doesn't fade. I'll get rid of the opacity here. All it does is shrink. But normal will do shrink and fade. There's also an animation style. And that can be ease or linear. And ease is the default, so we'll get rid of that. And show also accepts the same type of object, so if you wanted to, you could just pass a JSON object into here. And show actually has a lot more properties that you can set. You can set duration. You can set the final display. For instance, you can set it to display block or inline block. If you have a specific style that you want to set for display, you can explicitly set the final opacity. So that overrides the opacity that was previously in the element or group of elements, because these functions will transform anything that is matched by the query selector. So similar to how we had a hide style with the hide function, the show function allows show style. And the options that are possible for this are normal, fade, and grow, which is the opposite of shrink. And if you are using grow or normal, then the object will start off as a 0 by 0 pixel box and grow into whatever the original size of the div should be. But if you want to explicitly set the width and height, you can also set a target width and a target height using this. And of course, this is any .css valid length string. So if you have, if you just pass in a number, that'll be in pixels, but you can just put it in quotes to get any units you want, and this should animate just fine. There's also an animation style if you wanted to have a linear animation instead of a ease animation. You can do that for whatever reason if you want to have that. And if you are using the advanced options, again, you can just use complete to set a function to be called when the animation is complete. So some of these convenience functions are sort of works in progress, and I'm not sure if this is going to be the final product, but right now this is what's working for me. So that's pretty good. There's also a fade in and fade out function, just like you would get in jQuery. Those are just wrappers for hide and show, and they're much simpler. So if you wanted to do something like fade in or fade out, so let's just comment this out. Just because this is kind of a common transition, I guess, and I wanted to include it. But you would do fade out. And all it accepts is a duration, and optionally you can pass in a callback, an on-complete callback as a second parameter. But for now, we'll just do this. So that's all there is for this tutorial. Hopefully that's enough to get you started. Try .css today. In conclusion, it's a really great framework for doing any type of CSS based on JavaScript. It's great because it does the units for you, and it also does things like animations very well, especially affine transformations, color transformations, any type of numerical transformation. It took a great deal of work to put this library together, and I'm going to continue working on it. But despite the time investment it took to build this project, it's already helped me become much more productive in all of my projects. And you know what they say, time is money. So if you do find that this makes you more productive, please consider tipping your developer so that I can make more time to focus on projects like this. Seriously, I can't do it without you, and your contributions really mean a lot to me. Oh, and also hit me up with an email if you find any bugs or if you want to request a feature. I usually just add features as I need them, but I'd love to know what you guys would like to see in future updates. Alright folks, happy coding.